In recognizing this, you encounter a level of clarity that does not arise from argument. It arises from observing the activity of the mind without becoming entangled in it. The search for certainty shifts from chasing perfect conclusions to observing the nature of awareness itself. At the end of this inquiry, the movement of argument slows. You recognize that the attempt to force certainty through thought was never the path to clarity. Al-Ghazali's journey shows that when you examine the limits of perception, memory, and reason, and when you observe the subtle distortions created by the self, the mind becomes quieter. Not because it has found a final conclusion, but because it no longer demands one. You begin to understand that truth is not something the mind captures. It is something that becomes evident when the interference of thought reduces. Awareness continues without effort. Knowing continues without being claimed. The clarity that appears is not the result of argument but the absence of distortion. This is the silence Al-Ghazali pointed toward, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding. A state where thinking still occurs, but it no longer tries to secure itself. A state where awareness remains steady even as thoughts pass. In this silence, certainty is no longer an object to pursue. It is simply the stability of seeing without the pressure to conclude. The mind rests without abandoning inquiry. Awareness remains without needing confirmation. This is not an ending but a continuation in a different key. A form of knowing that does not seek possession but clarity. A recognition that truth is not forced into coherence. Truth appears when the self's interference fades. This crisis opens space for a new direction. Instead of piling arguments on top of shaky foundations, you begin looking deeper into the nature of the foundations themselves. Reason is indispensable, yet Al-Ghazali recognized that it operates within boundaries. Reason can evaluate contradictions, refine ideas, and expose faulty thinking. It can test coherence and highlight inconsistencies. But it cannot step outside itself to validate its own structure. Reason depends on the definitions and assumptions with which it begins. If those assumptions are flawed, the conclusions retain the flaw. You see this in your own thinking. When you examine your reasoning closely, you notice that your conclusions often reflect your expectations more than the actual logic guiding them. You interpret evidence through lenses shaped by your prior beliefs. Al-Ghazali understood that reason is a powerful instrument, but only within the domain of what it already accepts. It cannot provide the ultimate foundation for certainty because it cannot justify the premises it assumes. Acknowledging this is not a rejection of rationality but a refinement of it. When you understand its limits, reason becomes clearer, not weaker. It stops pretending to provide final answers and instead becomes a tool for clarifying what can be clarified. This shifts your approach to knowledge. Instead of demanding certainty from reason, you allow reason to play its proper role. You use it to identify errors, expose contradictions, and refine understanding, while recognizing that the deepest ground of knowing must come from a dimension beyond argument alone. Once Al-Ghazali recognized the limits of the cognitive tools themselves, he turned toward the condition of the mind using those tools. He observed that the self influences perception far more deeply than the senses or reason alone. Desire shapes interpretation. Fear alters judgment. Preference influences what you see and what you ignore. You begin to see this dynamic within yourself. When you want an answer to be true, your reasoning subtly moves in its direction. When a conclusion threatens your identity, you find ways to dismiss or reinterpret the evidence. When a belief supports the image you hold of yourself, you defend it with excessive confidence. Al-Ghazali argued that intellectual clarity requires inner clarity. The mind cannot perceive truth accurately when it is entangled in its own motives. He was not pointing to morality in the traditional sense. He was pointing to distortion. A mind clouded by attachment cannot function neutrally. This shifts the focus from cognitive tools to psychological transparency. The question is no longer only whether perception, memory, or reasoning are reliable. It becomes whether you, as the one employing these faculties, are in a state that allows them to function without interference. This insight moves knowledge from an external pursuit to an internal discipline. You are not simply examining facts. You are examining the conditions that make accurate perception possible. The task becomes less about gathering information and more about removing the distortions that prevent you from seeing clearly. At this point, Al-Ghazali reinterprets doubt. In ordinary thinking, doubt is seen as destabilizing, a force that weakens belief. But he understood that doubt, when applied deliberately, is a method of purification. It strips away untested assumptions and reveals the underlying structure of the mind. You begin to see how this functions. When you question a belief, you expose the reasons you hold it. Some beliefs persist because they serve emotional needs. Others remain because they are familiar. Still others survive simply because you have never scrutinized them. Doubt, in this disciplined sense, is not the opposite of trust. It is the gateway to a deeper form of trust. Once you have examined a belief thoroughly, whatever remains is more resilient than what you merely accepted. Al-Ghazali used doubt not to eliminate knowledge but to refine it. His period of questioning purified the ground on which certainty could emerge. You adopt a similar stance. You examine each assumption, not for the sake of dismantling your worldview but to uncover whether your worldview rests on stable ground. This kind of doubt does not paralyze. It strengthens. It removes what is weak so that what is strong can stand without the burden of false support. As the practice continues, you notice that your need for forced certainty decreases. You no longer cling to conclusions. You observe the structure of your understanding with increasing honesty. With the ground cleared, you confront one of Al-Ghazali's most subtle observations. You cannot escape the structure of your own mind. Even when you doubt, your doubt operates within the framework of prior knowledge. Thought questions itself using patterns formed by thought. You interpret reality through concepts you did not choose consciously. This is the hidden trap. You cannot step outside your own awareness to compare it with an external standard. All verification happens within the system you are trying to verify. This recognition is not meant to produce confusion. It is meant to reveal the limits of the approach you have been relying on. When you see these limits clearly, a different kind of understanding arises. The mind stops demanding certainty from tools that cannot provide it. It rests in a quieter recognition. Awareness itself is constant, even when thought fluctuates. Al-Ghazali pointed to a stillness beneath the movement of reasoning. This stillness is not a mystical state but a simple fact. Awareness is present before thought begins, continues while thought moves, and remains when thought dissolves. It does not need justification because it is the ground on which justification occurs. You begin with a simple but disturbing realization. The mind trusts itself without ever having confirmed its own reliability. You navigate the world using perception because perception is immediate. You rely on memory because memory seems continuous. You depend on reasoning because reasoning appears orderly. Yet none of these are immune from error, and you know this from your own experience. This is where Al-Ghazali enters as an interruption to your habitual confidence. He suggests that your fullest sense of certainty may be nothing more than a mental habit. You have never stepped outside the mind to evaluate it objectively. You use thought to judge thought and perception to judge perception. The circle closes before you even notice the loop forming. Al-Ghazali's insight is not meant to cast you into skepticism. Instead, it asks you to recognize the thinness of what you call certainty. The conviction you feel is not evidence. It is only a sensation. You may feel certain and still be mistaken. You may feel doubtful and still be correct. This understanding quietly shifts the ground beneath your assumptions. Certainty becomes less of a conclusion and more of a psychological state. And once you see that certainty can exist without truth, the mind opens into a different kind of inquiry. One that is less concerned with defending beliefs and more concerned with examining the conditions that produce them. Yet a fundamental question remains at the threshold of this examination. If the mind is the instrument through which you know anything at all, how can you confirm the reliability of the instrument itself? To understand the precision of Al-Ghazali's inquiry, you consider the intellectual world that shaped him. 11th century Baghdad was overflowing with scholarship. Philosophers constructed systems to explain reality through rational analysis. Theologians argued over fine distinctions in doctrine. Jurists debated the principles that should govern society. It was a time of intellectual confidence, an era that believed reason could unlock certainty. Al-Ghazali rose to prominence within this environment. His mastery of logic, philosophy, and law was widely recognized. He understood intimately the strengths of the arguments presented by different schools of thought. But it was precisely this mastery that allowed him to see their limits. He recognized that each system relied on assumptions the others rejected. Each tradition claimed certainty, yet each contradicted the next. This inconsistency revealed something fundamental. Rational structures do not guarantee truth. They reflect the assumptions from which they emerge. The more Al-Ghazali engaged these debates, the more he sensed that no argument, no matter how refined, could escape the premises it quietly inherited. Reflecting on his context offers a parallel to your own. Your world, too, is filled with information and analysis, yet clarity remains rare. Arguments multiply, but agreement does not. Observing Al-Ghazali's environment helps you understand why intellectual achievement alone cannot resolve the deeper issues of knowledge. Al-Ghazali's transformation began when he inspected the foundations of knowledge with uncompromising honesty. He started with the senses. Perception appears direct, but you know from experience that it can mislead. Distance alters shapes, lighting alters color, expectation alters interpretation. The senses do not reveal reality as it is. They reveal impressions filtered through conditions. He moved to memory. Memory seems stable, but it is reconstructed, not replayed. It shifts to maintain coherence, aligns itself with new interpretations, and fills in gaps without your awareness. The continuity you feel through memory is not evidence of accuracy but of psychological necessity. Then he confronted reason. Reason feels solid because it follows rules, but its conclusions depend entirely on premises it does not verify. A logical argument can be valid yet completely wrong if its foundation is unsound. Reason organizes experience but cannot guarantee the truth of the assumptions behind that organization. This realization produced what Al-Ghazali later described as a crisis, not in the emotional sense, but in the epistemological one. He saw that he could not justify the tools he relied upon to justify everything else. You experience a similar shift when you examine your own cognitive security. You recognize that you have trusted perception, memory, and reasoning simply because you must rely on something. You have never confirmed them, you have only used them.